Hi, everyone. My name is Ayça Alemdaroğlu. I'm a political sociologist, and I'm currently directing program on Turkey at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. I'm glad to be part of this summer institute, and thank you all for taking time to participate to study youth culture and politics in the Middle East and Latin America. Hopefully, my colleagues and I will help you get a perspective on historical and social studies on youth in these regions and give you some useful tips about how to convey this information in your classrooms. I truly believe in the development of understanding of other societies and histories and the affinity and empathy that emerge from that understanding as a key to a peaceful coexistence in the world. I wish all nations have these kind of resources for their teachers and students to have that, have a global perspective. But of course, some countries have more impact on the others and on the rest of the world. And the US is such a country, especially looking from the lens of the Middle East and my own country where I was born and I grew up. I see it more clearly how the ways in which the American policy choices affected, my own country, the opportunities, at least since the Cold War. So analyzing this connectedness and how, for instance, the development and politics of young people in a country such as Turkey or Egypt or Iran are connected to the US foreign policy and economic policies is an important part of, I think, understanding our global connectedness. As the mother of two, an 8th grader and a 2nd grader, both going to public schools, I know also the value and the power of K-12 teachers in shaping the minds of next generations. My 8th grader, especially, I mean, his like global and emotional horizon have expanded so much this year, despite the pandemic. And I don't know how to really thank his teacher for that. It was like it has been a really good year for him, despite everything. So I will contribute to this summer institute by talking about sociology and politics of youth in the Middle East. In particular, I'll be conveying the things I learned from my own readings and research in sociology and political science, as well as my own experience as once a young person growing up in Turkey. I write on how young people's lives, opportunities, and experiences are shaped by politics and governments, and how their demands, aspirations, and attitudes affect political ideas, activism, and protest. So although I focus on youth-related issues, my approach is more about analyzing the society and politics through what happens to young people and how they react. So my major concern is about social change and politics, but I look at it through the lens of young people. So, and I'm recently interested in questions about authoritarianism and authoritarian resilience and how youth's opportunities and constraints are shaped in these authoritarian regimes. During the Q&A, we will have a chance to more, I think, go into that. For now, I just want to give you an idea of my interests so that we will have a chance to talk about them later. So my goal will be to provide you with some analytical concepts and a sociological understanding that will help you hopefully to develop a perspective on youth in the region. But many issues I would cover, I think, will resonate with the experiences of young people in other societies, especially in this country, as well as in Latin American countries. I'm lucky that my lecture follows a number of others, and in particular, Professor Heidi Morrison's lecture on children and childhood in the Middle East history since 1800s. I think her lecture was an excellent introduction to both the ways in which social scientists approach and research youth, but it also gave you a panoramic view of the impact of colonial histories on children. The colonial history or histories tell that our past are marked by domination and exploitation, and children's livelihoods and their political significance are inherently related to global hierarchies and the relations between the colonizers and colonized. And I think her lecture did a very good groundwork for my lecture about the concepts and ways of thinking about children and youth. As you might remember, she talked about children as political subjects. She talked about age as a social construct, which both ideas will be appearing in this lecture as well. So I want to give you a little outline before we start. So we're going to cover first how the sociologists study youth. We're going to be talking about what they really focus on when they study youth. And I want to give this to you in a simplified way, which is they focus on commonalities and differences. And then there are two different approaches that are, that is like focusing on individual outcomes or more structural perspectives. Second, we'll be talking about Muslim youth. This term has become very popular since September 11th. So we will we'll talk about what this term, how it's used, and together with it, we'll be thinking against these totalizing cultural definitions and approaches. Thirdly, we're going to be talking about what's the experience of being young and political in contemporary Middle East. And in that framework, I want to give you snippets of recent uprising, youth demands, and government reactions in more contemporary times. So the learning outcomes. So we'll be, at the end of this lecture, you have an understanding of prominent sociological approaches and concepts. Hopefully I'll be able to convey you a critical perspective on youth in Muslim majority nations in the Middle East. And thirdly, you will have an understanding of politics of youth, characteristics of recent mobilization and their political impact in the early 21st century. All right, so first, the sociological perspective. So one way of studying youth is really focusing on commonalities. And what are those commonalities? One is the age, right? Age as a sociobiological category. Heidi Morrison talked about this in terms of like age as a social construct. So there is a biological basis to age, of course, but how that age, what that age means, what we expect from the people in that age group, is very much related to how society thinks about that age group, right? So it's a very socially constructed term. When I started, for instance, research, youth was often defined as, and this is back in the early 2000s, youth was often defined as people in between 15 and 20 years old, especially by global agencies like the UN and the World Bank. But nowadays, for instance, it's more like 15 to 30 years, even 34. And this new range is related to lengthening of dependency of young people with the changing economic opportunities. And this example show us that that setting an age boundary to what counts as youth is very arbitrary, and especially in an era in which these transitions from childhood to adulthood are less age dependent and fuzzy. So in my work, for instance, I really prefer this term young adult, I think, which really acknowledges the fluidity of these categories and show this in-betweenness of young people. The second term the second concept that sociologists study youth is generations, and this is a sociopolitical category. And as one of the famous German sociologists remind us, his name is Karl Mannheim, as he reminds us in his very famous book, The Problem of Generations, each generation has specific life chances based on their location in the history, in time, basically. And this location corresponds to a particular socioeconomic and political order. Therefore, one can argue that young people, independent of cultural and religious backgrounds, in this case, Muslim youth, are subjected to certain global economic and political circumstances. And these are like, increasing unemployment or underemployment, poverty, informalization, privatization of education, and periodic economic crisis. So the common place in time, or the common place that they have as a generation in history, is not only evident in shared structures of opportunity, but also in shared narratives, shared political dreams, political demands, desires. And these narratives, really, when we study these narratives, we understand what the generational change is. So while acknowledging the historical conjunctures and communality, it's also important to dwell on the experience that divide young people, that are conditioned by social class, gender, race and ethnicity, and nationality. And this is the differences part that many sociologists focus on when they study young people. And when sociologists say differences, they usually refer to inequalities and hierarchies in access to resources, in the ways in which people know their place in the society. So the first inequality that we study in sociology is social class. And there are objective basis to social, how we sort of operationalize social class. There's the economic basis. This includes people's income as well as wealth. There are cultural sort of basis of social class, which is education, which is education of your parents and grandparents. So this is basically the cultural capital that you have in starting life. So that really tells sociologists about also your social class. And finally, the social resources and social networks. So you can, for instance, come from a very marginalized, class in a city like Istanbul, for instance. But if you are somehow connected to powerful political groups or the ruling party, at the moment is Justice and Development Party, that connection, that social capital you have, makes a difference in your life than other people who do not have that kind of connection in your community. So that is also very much important for sociologists to think about how people are connected to different powerful political groups or community groups in the society. So second, when sociologists talk about social class, they also talk about subjective class positions. And this refers to the impact, impact in the formation of young people's perceptions and practices, and the way in which they internalize their class position and the sort of more economic and structural constraints that it means for them. So people acquire certain dispositions connected to their social location, and these dispositions, these sort of understandings of their place, give them a sense of their place, and it also informs their relations with other people. So it's a very common thing, for instance, in the US, but also in other countries. And I found this very much in my research, that when I talk to young people from lower income groups, they don't necessarily think of themselves as low income. They always tell me that, we're like middle class. So this thing, how they come to think about their class position is very much about political narratives, about cultural perception of the society and those differences. So what I mean by that is that when we think of social class, we as sociologists talk about both the objective basis as well as subjective basis, which is how people define their place in the society. So it's important also from our perspective to really look at the gender differences. And these are a range of characteristics pertaining to and differentiating between femininity and masculinity mostly. And these are basically the sociological and cultural aspects of one's biological sex. Being a woman and a man or a man come with certain freedoms and constraints in different societies. So when you look at, for instance, people's access to different resources in a country like Egypt, for instance, you need to not only think about their social class position, whether they have access to education, their income, their family wealth, those kind of things. But you also have to pay attention to their gender, when we think about gender in Muslim majority countries, this has been a very, very important subject. And there's a huge literature on gender-based inequalities and women's sort of subordination. One thing that sociologists of the Middle East that we're trying to be sort of careful about is there's a very dominant inclination to think about women's subordination or women's the gender inequality in these societies, and associate that inequality or explain that equality very much with religion, right? According to this idea, Islam is a religion and it's the main source of culture in Muslim societies. And therefore, the religion informs and legitimizes practices including polygamy, the stigmatization of, for instance, menstruation, unequal inheritance laws that discriminate against women. And as I said, this argument became very prevalent in the international scene. during recent, during campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq. From this view, religion is the most remarkable sort of obstacle toward, against people's, against development, democracy, and equality. So other scholars have challenged this explanation and argue that, the oppressive practices against women or young women are not inherent to Islam, but they've been shaped by various other things, various other social factors. And they pointed out that it is the patrilineage and endogamy in agricultural societies through which the property, descent, and residence proceed through the male lineage that discriminate against women both in the Middle East as well as in other countries. So they replaced explanation based on religion with the idea of patriarchy, which is common to many societies. It's not just about the Muslim Middle East. Since the 70s, this more latter explanation has been the central in sociology of the Middle East. But there are, of course, like certain problems with every framework. When you name something, you always sort of neglect or ignore some of the differences within that category. And in terms of like our understanding of patriarchy, people argue that the concept lacks sort of this analytical strength to capture the diverse historical factors such as colonialism, such as nationalism, such as westernization. So basically, the critics pushed for a more tuned understanding of patriarchy and how it shapes in different historical periods. And we covered this you covered this in at least in Heidi Morrison's lecture about like the impact of colonialism and nationalism and what it means for these societies and how it sort of refashioned certain structural economic and political inequalities. So there's also like important factors like race, ethnicity, and nationality. Race and ethnicity is something that we talk about in this country a lot. The differences. What difference does race and ethnicity make in people's access to rights and freedoms and resources, right? And when you look at the Middle East, and for instance in Turkey, like it really matters if you're coming from a Turkish majority or a Kurdish minority. That's a very, very important factor that shapes your life chances. But it also, like, you can't just make that analysis. You have to look at the social class of the person. You have to look at the gender. Yes, race and ethnicity matters, but it matters also in intersection with one's class and gender. There's finally like nationality. This is more like if you're doing a comparative study, it refers to, of course, differences between nations, but of course also the hierarchies. If you're coming from global South, what that means for your ability to acquire valuable resources. So that also, some sociological research also pay attention to these larger global hierarchies. All right, so finally, in terms of the sociological perspective on youth, I want to mention one important methodological distinction between individualism and structuralism. So there have been, these are mainly, have been like two theories in operation. For individualism, there's a strong sort of emphasis on individual agency and his or her capacity for a rational and autonomous action as the main social determinant of social life. So in youth studies, the emphasis on agency crystallizes in this individualization thesis, like which suggests that youth lives have become more diverse, less structured, and more individually determined, with the weakening of class divisions and support networks such as the family and the community, at least since the World War II. So it's and accordingly the changing patterns and meanings of work, and we're talking about less structured career paths, longer education, social mobility, and increasing emphasis on leisure. So these changing patterns and meanings of work and the changing forms and values of families, such as increasing divorce rates, increasing cohabitation, extramarital child rearing, and so on and so forth. These changing forms help replace class and communal identities, so allowing individuals more freedom in determining their futures. So there was an era when I was starting, my academic research, where this was the main sort of theoretical frame, especially in Europe. When you were doing, youth studies, you talk about how young people sort of change these structures, and all that. On the other hand, there's also a very strong structural component in sociological studies, and this basically emphasizes that the young people are, even though they are changing, society is changing, young people are still constrained by the inequalities that I mentioned, such as class, such as gender, and these sociological structures reproduce themselves through people. Although you may be young and you may be against certain patriarchal norms, or you may refuse to go through these like more set career paths, although these career paths are, let's say, for young people, they are no more available. For instance, in the Middle East, one of the valued sort of ways of finding a job is is in the public sector. That's the job that with more benefits, more security, but these structures are basically changing, right? So the idea there is like, even though young people may be against those things, there is still like these structures are more powerful than human beings, and they reproduce them over and over. So young people do not have that much of freedom to break out of them unless the larger structures change. Most approaches, most sociologists position themselves somewhere in between these two theoretical positions and produce work that take into consideration of structures, but they also focus on the individual and individual sort of ability to negotiate these various constraints on themselves. All right, so as a lesson plan, I thought you could maybe watch Garbage Dreams by Mai Iskandar. This is I think films are really good for understanding this the emotional, more individuals, like individual universe of the Middle East. But they also give you a perspective on the both the micro structures, social structures, as well as the macro global factors in people's life. And this is, I think, is such a film. So the film is about garbage collectors in Cairo, and these are young people mostly featured in the film. They are recent or former immigrants to the city from rural areas, from Upper Egypt, which is the south of Egypt. And they come to the city because their livelihoods in rural regions become less sustainable. And they come to the city. Of course, the cities like Cairo, like Istanbul, had very low ability or low capacity to embrace the immigrants, rural to urban immigrants. So basically, these immigrants had to, make their homes, create their jobs, right? They started, living in these very makeshift arrangement houses, and then they, create this economy of like collecting garbage. But the film shows us that with this recent changes, the Cairo municipality decided to give these garbage collection job, basically subcontracted this business to multinational garbage disposal companies. There are various like discussions about the whether the garbage collectors in Egypt were more doing a more sustainable sort of job of garbage collecting with their, using more organic methods. But I think I thought this could be a good lens to both, the more micro community in the Middle East, in Egypt, and you could discuss the experience of garbage collectors and how they are shaped. You can discuss whether the structures, what kind of structures are influencing their lives, what are the individual stories. You can discuss the role of social class, their class subjectivity. You can talk about ethnic differences. So these are mostly like Christian minority. So it's you can discuss the diversity within these societies to break that more sort of totalizing understanding of Middle East as all Muslim. And you can also talk about the global inequalities, like how these multinational companies are taking over some of the economy, parts of the economy, and what that means for local people. So I will include a link with the material that I will be suggesting for you. So let's see. So the garbage streams is also, as I said, a good way of sort of thinking about this term Muslim youth. whether, young people are all Muslim and what being Muslim means, those kind of issues. As I mentioned in the very introduction, the experiences of young people in Muslim majority countries and also young Muslim immigrants in Europe, become very, popular topics in newspapers and op-eds, and people have been talking about, this this term as they worry about their numbers, the demography of young people in the Middle East, as well as their feelings. And they've been, this issue has been talked about as a security issue. For instance, like one such analysis is the youth bulge theory. So according to this theory, a high proportion of youths in comparison to the rest of the population in these countries constitutes a major security threat to the West. And accordingly, as growing number of young people grow frustrated and resentful with little opportunity and parental or weakening parental authority, they become potential actors of religious insurgency, social unrest, war, and terrorism. So, for instance, like following the same logic, some authors argue that, for instance, the only way for Western nations to stop fighting in Palestine is to stop funding, Palestinian youth bulge. And, again, following the same perspective, for instance, Turkey is becoming an ever reliable partner due to its increasing fertility rates. But we know these theories do not hold very well. But unfortunately, they became quite prominent in the circles of Pentagon, CIA, NATO, and also for the the military strategy of the US. So what are the problems with this perspective? First of all, like it really marshals demography into a military strategy and feeds into alarmist images of young people in the Middle East. It creates these more like racist and fears and cultural stereotypes about Muslim youth. It basically like locates some sort of violence within the increasing numbers of the young people. For instance, as one critic rightfully argues, the youth bulge argument can tell us nothing about the oppressive character of the Shah's regime in Iran, the terror of Israeli occupation of Palestine, the horror of the US wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So it's basically the youth bulge argument is not really considerate of the historical factors that create all these conditions, like the material conditions, as well as the subjective conditions of young people in the Middle East, right? So without really thinking about the long and rich history of these global interventions, we can't really understand the globe and its impact on these cultures and societies. So, and for instance, in my own study, I'm very interested in these cyclical, almost military interventions in Turkey, with the question that, how come that there are all these young people, educated youth, very interested in the world affairs, very interested in democratizing Turkey, but yet Turkey always ends up with some sort of authoritarian cycle, some sort of authoritarian regimes. The sort of democratization, the light democratization sort of process that we have, always somehow followed by an authoritarian period. So in that sense, I'm interested in the question of, like, for instance, if we take it from the second half of the 20th century, from the Cold War era, there was like a bottom-up democratization and demands, but then what happened? For me, it's really important to think about youth politics in Turkey in the larger context of the Cold War, and how, like, American sort of support for certain right-wing ultranationalist groups within Turkey to contain the USSR, lead to the repression of these democratic factors within the country. So when you think about youth as just as numbers, there's no way that you can also, like, think about these historical trends, historical factors that affect young people's political views. So second, I think when we think about Muslim youth, it's very much thought as, from the very Orientalist and ethnocentric conception as Muslim youth, as the different, as the other. And this more sort of, Muslim youth is like that because, because of their culture, that this idea that the culture really leads people to act in certain ways. And the problem with, let's say, Middle East democratization is that their culture doesn't really allow participation or more horizontal sort of distribution of power. But this is also not right, because there are certain problems with thinking just with focusing on people's culture. One problem, of course, is this cultural perspective homogenizes and essentializes culture. For instance, like in the case of the Middle East, there is this understanding of, okay, there's not only difference, but also there's inequality between Western and Eastern cultures. There is an inferiority sort of attached to Muslim youth. But this again, really creates a problematic sort of, I think, misunderstanding. It basically creates a misunderstanding towards understanding young people conditions and political views in the Middle East. So to sort of avoid that kind of cultural stereotyping, there are certain things that anthropologists and sociologists do. One is that they talk about larger, they talk about global capitalism and how young people share very similar experiences in terms of finding a job, in terms of gaining their livelihood across nations, right? They are affected in various ways, but from similar trends like privatization of education, like increasing insecurity, right? In terms of benefits and basically access to jobs and so forth. So basically seeing these larger global structures and how they affect people in different countries is a way of thinking against this cultural sort of more ethnocentric conception of young people in other places. So another way is to think about all the inequalities that I mentioned. So, okay, there is maybe some people are, yes, there is this society with Muslim majority population, but there are all these differences and inequalities, and the way people sort of interpret culture, interpret religion, perform religion is very different, and in relation, and it's informed by their social class, their gender, ethnicity, and so forth. Finally, to think against culture is we need to also think about social change, right? These cultures are not frozen, right? They change. So for instance, in my work, I focus on different generations of women and how they perform femininity, and what are the sort of cultural narratives that inform their gender roles, gender norms, and then how that sort of changes from their grandmothers to their themselves. So this view of thinking about change is something that we also need to do to not essentialize a certain group of young people living in the Middle East. Okay, so as a lesson plan, I thought I could suggest this book. It's a graphic novel, Dare to Disappoint, by Özge Samancı. And it's a very accessible book. It's about growing up in Turkey. It's a coming to age story. And I think it will be interesting to discuss the social and political conditions of coming to age in Turkey, and also like social and political sort of divisions and differences, and the diversity within Muslim societies, to sort of break this more, homogenizing view of these societies. So I think this will be a very fun read for your students, as well as a great resource for tackling some of the issues that I've been talking about. Okay, so finally, youth politics. So, excuse me. Okay. So, starting from the French Revolution and the nation state idea that came afterwards, there's like this idea of thinking of young people as a progressive group, like with a progressive political mission, and this is like because young people come to this world, and it's like really related to this idea of generations that I was talking about. Young people come to this earth with different dispositions, right? Because they live in a different time with different resources, and they sort of go for emancipation from the older structures. So this is a very sort of idealistic way of thinking about youth politics and power. Yeah, youth as a progressive force. And in the Middle East, we have seen this over and over. Actually, young people had power to do revolutions, change systems. So, like in Egypt or in Turkey, young people ignited protest movements. undermine existing systems and sometimes pave way to the way for a new order that sometimes ultimately excluded them. So there's much discussion on the role of youth in recent upheavals in the Middle East, and young people, but especially educated young people, always had some sort of political power associated with them, as well as in certain historical periods they act on that power. So the second is the idea that has been very sort of prominent in the way we think about politics and youth, is youth apathy. I came to this subject as someone who grew up in Turkey, as I mentioned. When I was 4 years old, the military intervened to take over the government. This was in 1980, and banned political parties, jailed politicians, detained thousands of people, and so forth. And while the coup was sort of led the way to economic liberalization in the country, it also helped it helped institute a very repressive order. And I grew up in that context. Although my parents, for instance, were really politically engaged, when I was growing up, they emphasized more about studying, doing well in school, rather than being interested in these more national and global political issues. So this repressive environment sort of also internalized by many parents, and created this generation of people who were both saw themselves as not interested in politics, but also criticized by some adults as not, taken responsibility in the society and in the country. So the recent uprising very much changed this perception of youth, of themselves as the sort of narratives of youth, right? The political narratives of the youth, as youth being apathetic. During the Arab uprisings of late 2000 and early 2011, 9 regimes throughout North Africa and Middle East, these are like 30-year dictators like President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, President Ben Ali of Tunisia. They confronted by major demonstrations, and basically many regimes were toppled down, and youth played a large part in the uprisings, as well as the ensuing political and social changes. In Tunisia, for instance, the uprising was the first true revolution in the 21st century, and it kickstarted the series of upheavals in other parts of the region. The fall of the regime and the dismantling of the ruling party. However, the Ben Ali is gone, but the tensions, of course, continued, and it's a question to what extent young people in Tunisia benefited from the order that was created afterwards. So these are current changes that one needs to sort of look at, but it's always a question to what extent it's a question in Egypt, in Turkey, to what extent after these uprisings that young people were able to make their voices heard. So the better case that I know, or that very naturally, because not only that I'm very focused on studying Turkey and Turkish politics, but also I was part of the various networks that that were active in the Turkey's uprising in 2013. So I will just give you a little sort of explanation about it to, to show you how like very small events can cause these like wider national demonstrations. So in the Turkish case, it started with a small sit-in in the Istanbul Taksim area. This is a very central location in Turkey, in Istanbul, and the sit-in started to protest the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan's this plan to replace this park with a mall and a residential structure. It's basically like taking away one of the areas that remain, green areas that remain in the middle of Istanbul, and replacing that with a urban project that will built a shopping mall and a residential area. So the activists in Istanbul were very much against it, and the way the police sort of reacted them created a resentment and frustration and anger in the society. And over about a month time in Turkey, these protests and really spread across Turkey. But what happened was that the governments basically not only just intervene to stop the uprising, I mean stop these protests, but also afterwards, when we look at what happened to the political narratives and control and repression in the country, this was a very like a turning point for a more authoritarian regime to establish itself. Because with the Arab uprising, as well as this like ongoing uprising in Turkey, the government realized that previously they were scared of the military interventions in the country, and this is a government that has like political Islamist roots. So they were feared of the military intervention, military coups of the secular old guard of the republic to topple down the government. With these demonstrations and uprising, they saw that actually the society may also cause them lose their power. So this was, in a way, a turning point for various authoritarian measures taken following these events. And when we look at the changing narratives, we see the regime is becoming much more, much more interested in creating this ideological narrative where they impose a religious and religious all right. Okay, so I want to talk about the common characteristics of 21st century uprisings. They happen in many places, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Turkey, before these countries. It has been going on in Iran. So one main characteristics that we are talking about it is that young people were really prominent in these uprisings. It's not that they were there as like part of any political party. They were there as individuals, as groups, as communities. So that was really interesting that these uprisings were not necessarily organized by one or the other political party. There were political parties in the squares, in Taksim Square in Istanbul, in Tahrir Square in Cairo. But at the end of the day, these were basically spaces where people from all sorts of all walks of life, all kinds of ideologies, all kinds of different ethnic and religious groups came together to voice their opposition to injustice, to their opposition to authoritarian repressive regimes. So that was a very interesting and important quality to these uprisings. Second, youth attitudes and mobilizational forms in these uprisings change over time. For instance, in the Istanbul sit-in, they really were responding to the government response to them. So they were changing, they were tailoring their opposition, their demonstrations. We have seen like various interesting art, like resistance through art performances. Also, we have seen like not only in Istanbul with the police repression and all that, we have seen many young people getting out of the streets in other parts of Turkey. So this shows like sort of the flexibility, the adaptability of these protests. We have also talked a lot about the social media, the significance of technology and changing technologies in letting people express their political demands in different ways. So some people said that, oh, these are like social media revolutions. If we didn't have Facebook, these uprising will not happen. But that's like not true, because in all these societies we have there's a continuous way of demonstrations and actions, right? Especially in Turkey, where we see like workers protests, we see different political parties organizing protests, so this is not just the Facebook. I mean, in the case of Egypt, for instance, there are all these like protests for bread, workers protests that really lead the way for these larger the larger uprising in 2011. So there are two other characteristics that I want to talk about. And this one is it's important how like how the regime in Egypt or Turkey reacted through a display of authoritarian resilience. So after these uprisings, we have seen a really strengthening of control and repression in society. So I think that's one of the ways in which we sort of mark this history, for instance, in the political history of Turkey, right? Like how the regime sort of learned its lesson as well, right? Because there's this huge population that is against it, which led the Turkey's Justice and Development Party to become much more afraid of its own future, as well as leading it to use more police force, more surveillance, and all that to keep young people under control. So I think my last point will be like when we're thinking about these uprisings, we have to think about the larger sort of political framework, the regime control and all that, but also like again, like from a more bottom-up perspective, we have to also think about how these people are organized, what their demands were, and all that. So in conclusion, I mean, when we look at these uprisings in different places, I mean, they have all their different histories, so we have to be a little bit more careful in sort of too much generalizing. I'm just trying to give you a little understanding of this history. We can say that, especially in the Arab uprisings, they failed to achieve a lasting democratic change. And they, I think, revealed the limits of street protests. And many of the underlying problems that young people were protesting remain unresolved. But I think these, while the short term or the middle range sort of consequences of these uprisings are not absolutely positive at the moment, but we have to keep in mind these are sort of formations and experiences that somehow find voice in other ways in these countries. And when you look at, for instance, in the case of Turkey, there is a subjective generational understanding of Gezi youth, and these people are still, despite all the sort of control and political repression in the country, still producing alternative narratives, still producing sort of critical views and commentary about the government doing. So we have to also think about what these uprisings feed into, or how they find voice, especially the sort of the communities, the relationships that were formed in the streets, how they sort of evolve in the future of these countries. So as a lesson plan, I thought, I'm sorry, this was something that I want to talk to you. Like in the case of Turkey, we have seen a number of young people killed in the police violence, due to police violence. And one thing about them is that they're not only young, but they also, for instance, come from a certain religious background, which is the Alevi community, which really points to my earlier argument about that we really need to also think about these young people's, when we're making an analysis, where they come from, their social position, as well as their ethnic and ethnic identity and all that. So this is an important way also to sort of break down this idea of youth and thinking about differences and how they're articulated in these protests. Okay, so as a lesson plan, so I thought we didn't talk about here that much, but the Green Wave, the Green Revolution, and these are protests that against the results of the controversial 2009 elections in Iran, and they basically in these elections, President Ahmadinejad won the elections despite all the widely reported election irregularities. And protesters wanted the opposition candidate's election, and they basically created this campaign, "Where is my vote?" But of course, they were broken down by the, broken up by the brutal attacks of the government militia, as well as the police and paramilitary. So this film by Ayça Alemdaroğlu talks about young people's perspectives, the protesters' perspectives of what was going on during that time, during the protests. So you can, with your class, you can talk about the political demands and aspirations of young people. You can talk about obstacles that prevent them from achievement. You can, of course, like go a little bit into the history and talk about the historical making of the Iranian regime. And this really resonates with what I told you before about how, for instance, the American foreign policy in the making of the Islamist regime. You can also discuss how demands and experiences of Iranian youth are similar to or different from, say, collective right movements in the US, as well as you can talk about the use of technology and social media, because like many of the footage in this film is collected by basically individual people using their cameras and all that. So I thought this could be a good way of thinking about this other country, the Iran, Iran, which we hear a lot sort of about, and we hear about Iran usually in a very negative lens. I thought this movie could allow you to think and discuss a group of young people, politics and what they're trying to achieve there, so that it could break your your students' more totalizing understanding about Iran and all that. So these are all the things that I wanted to talk today. There's another sort of film about the Egyptian uprising, the January 25th revolution, The Square. This is available on Netflix. This could be also a good way of sort of discussing this, the recent uprising and young people's politics. I have some books that you can look into. The one thing common about these books is the way they the way they bring out the young people's voices. So bringing their voice into a picture and understanding their experiences, I think, very important to this endeavor of understanding those nations and youth politics there. So you can reach me at this email address if you have questions. I tried to cover a little bit of the concepts, a little bit of the sort of the methodology of research, as well as like some historical sort of experience of youth politics. I know it's a lot, but hopefully we will have a chance to maybe go more in detail during the Q&A. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you later.